I came from a society devoured by anti-Semitism. Truly, my own understanding of the modern Middle East, but the obsession with Israel and the obsession with Jews has been the central tragedy that brought so much destruction, so much failure in various countries.
Hey, it's Aviva, and welcome to Boundless Insights. Today I pass the mic to my colleague and friend, Dr. Rachel Fish, for a deeper, longer-form conversation that steps back from the headlines and looks at the ideas shaping our world. In this episode, Rachel speaks with Hussain Abubakr Mansour, a writer and thinker whose work examines anti-Semitism, the Middle East, and the ideological currents shaping the global discourse. Hussain brings a perspective you don't often get to hear. He grew up in Egypt, immersed in a culture where anti-Semitism was pervasive, and later spent years trying to understand how those ideas take hold. In this conversation, Rachel and Hussain discuss why anti-Semitism is spreading so fast and can so easily cross political, cultural, and even ideological lines. They talk about how anti-Semitism functions as a kind of currency, something people can use, shape, and amplify to serve their own interests. It's a lot to cover, and so with that, I pass the mic to Rachel.
Thank you, Hussain, for joining us today. I am thrilled that you are coming to be in conversation with me on Boundless Insight. So thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for having me, Rachel. It's a pleasure.
Hussain, I actually want you to introduce yourself to our listeners. Tell us a little bit about who you are, where you come from, what you studied, and why you are writing about anti-Semitism, Zionism, Jews writ large.
I don't know how many hours you have, but I'll try to summarize. Well, my name is Hussain Abubakr Mansour. A lot of people know me from my Substack, the Abrahamic Metacritique, various things I write. I live in the States, but I actually was born in Egypt. I grew up in Egypt. I was born in 1989. And part of growing up in an Arab country is actually Jews are a central part of your life, despite the fact that you may not see a single one of all of your life, which was definitely the case of all my childhood. Because as many people now know, sadly, the problem of anti-Semitism, I mean, your life is about Jews, but not in any positive sense. It's just the culture has been saturated with truly obsessive anti-Semitic understandings of Jews and Jewish history and Zionism in Israel for quite some time. And it's like fish in water. It's just everywhere. It's part of the cultural vocabulary and atmosphere that you live in. And I happen to find it particularly interesting. It is interesting. I mean, anti-Semitism and its fascination and imagination, it's really a world of enchantment and visions of, civilizational dangers and threats and hidden evils. And so I was enchanted by this, especially, I came to age in the areas of the early 2000s. In the early 2000s, anybody who came to age at that time, and I discovered worldwide, we were all affected by just the whirlwind of 9/11, the rise of Al-Qaeda, Islamic jihadism, the Second Intifada, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan. People don't notice that these events actually happened. All of this condensed world history happened in a span of very few years. And that was hugely informative on a lot of people. So in the Middle East, of course, where actually this was the main theater of all of these events, culturally, media-wise, it's just the media was saturated with just anti-Americanism, anti-Semitism, and so on. And that made me decide to wanted to take this seriously. And I just got deeply interested in it. And I started to, learn through the internet everything I could about this issue. And I ended up with a life completely engrossed in the issue of Arabs and Israel, Jews, Judaism, so on and so forth. But ultimately, this led me to reach very different conclusion and understand the problematic nature, the deeply problematic and disturbing nature of modern Arab society that ended up being, in a very almost inexplicable way, organizing its thought morally, politically, around its singular obsession of Israel and anti-Zionism. When I started to reach these conclusions and trying to formulate my own ideas about them, that was late, maybe 2007, 8, 9. Arab Spring happens in 2010, 2011. Then ending up having to leave the country and move to the United States in 2012. And basically, since then, I invested my life in trying to understand why is this the case in the Middle East, in Arab societies, which, I came from Egypt. I care about no matter how far, how long I lived away from it, ultimately we do care. The place that we grew up in, that we come from, stays with us forever. So I've always cared about trying to understand, because it's better. Why are things that way? Because that means understanding myself ultimately. And I spent a long time trying to study the various components of this. And this is an extremely complex phenomenon. You know this, I have a lot of critiques about the entire industry since World War II of studying anti-Semitism with Jewish scholars. I think they flattened the issue. They actually, most of the time, they produced ideological work to serve the needs of liberal societies. And I have nothing against liberal societies, but that's a very different reality than trying to actually think through a complex problem like anti-Semitism. For example, I've never read a Jewish account of anti-Semitism in which I saw where I came from in it. Some do, of course, the ones who understand that the Middle East is a very important piece of the puzzle. But most part, it never really talks about, at least before October 7th. A lot of things obviously changed since October 7th. But anyways, so I spent a lot of time trying to actually understand what's going on. And then, to my biggest shock, I thought my life was about the Middle East. But to my biggest shock, of course, and the shock of many of us in the past few years, we're discovering now that, no, this is here too now. And this is a big problem. This is not just for me trying to understand myself, where I came from. It's about my future and the future of my children, and if America will remain the country that I arrived to.
Okay, so I have to just ask one question that relates to something you just said around you arrived at different conclusions.
Right.
When you were studying these subjects. And I want you to articulate a little bit more how it is that you arrived at these different conclusions and what skills you cultivated in your own learning, education, to be able to arrive at those different positions.
It's a great question, and I don't know if I have a good answer for it. If we can actually understand the process through which somebody can basically walk themselves out of Plato's cave, maybe we can replicate it. And I'm not sure, and this has been actually a big annoyance. It's probably the biggest problem, philosophical problem, that I personally have been dealing with for a long time, because it has to do with loneliness. Because, well, I'm trying to find out how can I create more me, so I'm not alone. And I still don't have a good answer. What skills I've cultivated? Language skills. I taught myself Hebrew to fluency from an early age. How to read text, which is a lost skill, by the way, including in the West. I mean, the humanities, everybody knows what happened to the humanities since the 1970s. People don't learn to read text. They learn to interrogate text. You become a Stasi or a KGB officer sitting across the table from a text that you want to just, do waterboarding and electrocute till the text confesses sins. And by the way, that's actually what usually Arabs do, who deals with this issue with Jewish texts, and they've done so historically, kind of enemy studies. But no, learning how to actually read texts and try to interact with texts, I can't tell how exactly that managed to help me change my opinions, because people also rationalize all the time. So I see people who do what I do, and they don't end up with different conclusions, but they manage actually to rationalize everything they expose themselves to reinforce the worldview. And I have to also say that it was not an easy process, because the tragedy of the modern Arab world, and this is really tragic, and even though that we're dealing with a serious problem that's really becoming life and death many times, that shouldn't stop us from actually even looking at it sympathetically. That you have an entire society that built big part of its identity on this terrible idea. And this terrible idea collapsing could mean that its entire identity would collapse. This is not an easy thing. So let's say about the Palestinians, and a lot of people already know this, and I wrote this about this extensively, that basically the core issue of the Palestinians, that the entire idea of Palestine and the Palestinian identity is just a negation of Zionism. There's just not much else to it. And that's very tragic, because that means, all right, how can you make that identity then pursue peace or settle? Of course it can't settle. It's revolutionary, it seeks negation. But that's also, it's not just that it's bad for the Israelis, it's also deeply bad for the Palestinians. It's really sad. How can you get someone to exit a negative identity into a positive identity structure? So this is what makes it also very, very difficult. I think that's why learning is very important, education is very important, but I don't think it's the only thing that is important. As a matter of fact, since October 7th, thank God, also a lot of people understand that having elite learning and education, it's not a guarantee for you to have even the most basic decency, as denouncing rape, denouncing mass murder of people in their beds. You would think that a very lucrative education in the world most eminent institutions would help you with that. Obviously didn't. So I gave you the long answer. The short answer is I learned a lot, but I'm not sure even how this learning itself gets converted into change.
Let's jump in that then, because as you mentioned, you have a Substack. We'll put a link in the show notes, the Abrahamic Metacritique. You've been writing prolifically on the Substack. And your most recent piece, or one of your most recent pieces, Antisemitism Has a Big Future,
Right.
was an essay that I felt needed greater unpacking. And that's why I really wanted to talk to you. And it's not the first time you and I have been in conversation, the first time on the podcast, yes. But I find that your perspective, Hussein, as an outsider who's able to look into this conversation with a different lens, is quite valuable in this moment, particularly whether we're talking about in the academic realm, whether it's in the Jewish communal spaces. And I thought it would be important for our listeners to actually think about this essay, which is really about the political economy of anti-Semitism.
Right.
So what does that mean?
It means basically that you're not just dealing with abstract ideas. So the problem of the tendencies, I think, of liberal societies in the past 20 years, especially with the advance of identity politics, that everything becomes an identity, an idealism. Well, they hate them because they are awful. We hate them because they are great. And everything becomes really immaterial in a lot of ways. Now, ideas matter a lot. Obviously, I write a lot of intellectual history. I wouldn't write a lot of intellectual history if I didn't think that ideas matter. But ideas mattering, or the importance of idea, is inseparable from the material lives of people. So yes, like I write a lot about trying to understand the structure of anti-Semitism, how you organize morality around an anti-Semitic idea. It's important as a negative, kind of a negative theology in the post-Christian age and how that affected Muslims. I write about these things extensively, but by the end of the day, these things do not explain how suddenly this idea, all of a sudden, as we saw in the United States, let's say only in the past year, especially among the American right, who used to be hawkish and pro-Israel and anti-Iran, almost, by consensus, still very recently, all of a sudden adopts this idea and runs with it and becomes now a self-generating system that actually enforces itself and grows. In order to understand those dynamics, you have to look at actual political, that is, you have to look at concrete interests of class, of actual political players, of power, that is deploying these ideas to achieve goals. So here you have supply side and you have demand side. The demand side political economy of this, or the symbolic economy of this, is people who need anti-Semitism. They are, because they have religious needs, they have theological needs, they have scapegoating needs. We all see these terrible memes online, like, this is what they took from you, right? So obviously here you have a demand. There's somebody who's obviously feel that their life is very negative. They are looking for an explanation and somebody to blame and all of this. So that's the demand side of anti-Semitism. Well, there's the supply side of anti-Semitism. That is now that the actually people who's going to supply this, because they are ultimately profiting from it, and profit economically and politically. And once we decide that this is what we're going to look at, we're going to find an extremely complex picture in which you have a domestic level, that is actual political actors in the United States who have an incentive to invest in generating anti-Semitic discourse, whether pundits, competing for the future of the MAGA movement after Trump, people who want to take the spot, let's say, of Ben Shapiro and his audience. That's a real career economic competition that's happening in which you can deploy anti-Semitism to win. So you have that domestic level. And of course, there is domestic competition within the Democratic Party, as everybody knows, over the future of the Democratic Party. That's over politics. That's over decision and power in the future. So you have that domestic level. Above that domestic level, you have other levels. You have international levels and you have geopolitical levels. So the geopolitical level, let's say that you have a state like Qatar. Now, again, you have to forget about ideology. You have to forget about who believes in what. No, we're going to talk about real interests here. Let's say I'm in the state of Qatar. I'm an enormously wealthy state, but very tiny. I want to punch above my weight. I have huge influence, and I want to be protected. So in order to achieve this, I need to be protected by America. Nobody can protect me than anybody like the United States. I need to have influence over my Arab neighbors who are very huge, like, let's say, Egypt, much bigger than me. So I'm going to patronize the Islamist movements that destabilize them. so I have control over them, or invest in a massive media network that completely controls the narrative in the Arabic language and gives me enormous leverage over all my neighbors and so on and so forth. And the way to do this is to invest in anti-Semitism. And then you see what's happening domestically in the United States. So now America, through our own logic, we started generating an anti-Semitic movement. Well, it serves my strategic interest. So I can go there and invest in it as well. And that would give me even more leverage over American foreign policy. So you see this dynamic. And it's not just Qatar. Think about the Iran. As a matter of fact, there is something I think enormously important that we just witnessed in the past 2 months, that people have to be realistic that, no, this is actually happening. The United States is the single most powerful nation on earth. It's not questionable. The Iran war actually proved it. We literally had a major war across the planet against a major Middle Eastern country, destroyed their entire military, and actually we felt nothing. Like, you go to Starbucks, nobody had no idea it was happening. The only thing that we feel is just the gas pump. It's $1 higher. But other than this, we didn't feel it. That's how powerful we are. We can destroy the military of an entire country like Iran, and actually nothing happens here. This is how powerful our technology is superior than anyone. There is no way to control United States action militarily by other people. No one can confront us. However, what this war has proven is that one of the very few tools to control the US foreign policy and military policy is domestic public opinion. And now domestic public opinion can be manipulated by all of these anti-Israel and anti-Semitic campaigns. If you are an adversarial country or an adversarial intelligence services, if you're Iran itself, China, Russia, Turkey, other countries, you see this, of course you're going to take this opportunity. Not to mention, of course, it's a democratic open society, free speech. We have the highest ceiling of free speech of any country else in the world. So people can actually do this. So it makes sense to come and invest in the anti-Semitic discourse here as a way for you, as a strategic player in your own geopolitical sphere, try to influence U.S. foreign policy. And then you have, of course, the international or the great power competition level, which is basically Russia and China. And also it makes sense if they see this. Now, China is watching all of this. And then they discover that you have, with a small investment in destabilizing discourse online, TikTok, whatever, you manage to extract enormous political cost from the United States. You can even change their military strategy by this. And so basically you end up with this bifurcated system in which, by the way, every layer of the system has its own logic and its own interest. Like, these are different chessboards in which there are different players playing different games. But all of them then converge on a single strategy that works for a team of them. And then ultimately you, as a person we're at the bottom of all of this. Let's say you're an American Jew, right? You're not really part of any of this system. How do you experience all of this? You experience it in the aggregate. You open the internet and there's a flood of unbelievable hatred. Your son, your daughter goes to the university and they see all of this is how you experience. You have no idea how this is happening. It's just you experience the aggregate of all of I tried to explain.
So let me ask you, Hussein, specifically, because what I want our listeners to understand is when you say these investors, and you named them at the domestic level, the geopolitical level, the international actors, are investing in anti-Semitism right now in order to create that destabilized discourse politically, culturally,
right,
in terms of the online discourse, et cetera. Tell our listeners exactly what you mean by what that investment looks like, very concretely.
Well, what that investment looks like, so Qatar is the most egregious example and most direct because of also they are one of the largest investors and they have been for quite some time. So that investment can be in media and propaganda networks. So Al Jazeera, which is really an empire, and it doesn't exist only in Arabic anymore, it's just Arabic and English, creates an enormous amount of media input, very sophisticated. They hire the best people. By the way, they literally hire the best people who are the graduates of the best media networks in the world, BBC, CNN, and so on and so forth. And they create a cutting edge political content that ultimately is entirely shaped by a worldview that demonizes Israel, demonizes the United States foreign policy as an instrument in Israeli hands, so on and so forth, and start producing just endless media fodder based on this. They've been doing this in Arabic for quite some time, then they do this in English and so on. But by the way, Al Jazeera is not the only thing that Qatar does. There's also a lot of other media networks in English that entirely run by funded by the Qataris. You have that. And then you have the universities. So Qatar has been a huge investor, obviously, in America. As a matter of fact, this very tiny Gulf state has been the largest foreign investor of U.S. higher education for quite some time, which is also begs the question why. We don't see any. It's not like they are at the cutting edge of biomedical research or anything, right? No, they are buying influence. They're buying enormous amount of influence. And if you see where they are investing, it makes sense. They invest in elite schools. And their biggest investment in the United States is actually in the most politically relevant university in the country, which is Georgetown University here in Washington, D.C. It's the number one feeder school for for the U.S. government, for diplomatic corps, for the CIA, for the Pentagon, it's Georgetown. It's the oldest university in the country that teaches foreign policy, government affairs, and so on and so forth. And they enormously invest in it. And there was a release from the House Education Committee that came out last March, about 900 pages document with a lot of emails between the Qatari Foundation and the Georgetown leadership and other universities and the Qatari Foreign Ministry. And you see the dynamics of the relationship. And you discover that, first of all, they control the hiring and the firing. They are sitting on the boards. They hiring a lot of their people who are all of them are anti-Israel, pro-Islamist professors. They hire them in Qatar, and then they send them to teach in DC, and then they fund them to, let's say, they funded directly. This was a shock that I actually saw today. I keep going through the document because it's very long. That the Qatari Foreign Ministry funded something called the Bridge Initiative. The Bridge Initiative is something that Georgetown does. And the Bridge Initiative is supposedly a study of the menace and the greatest menace that's now destroying Western society, Islamophobia. And it issues all of these big reports. By the way, a lot of it is fabricated data, in my opinion, about how actually Islamophobia is the worst problem in the country. It's way bigger than anti-Semitism. And it's research coming from Georgetown. And then this research gets circulated in the media channels that, surprise, surprise, are also funded by the Qataris and then are given to civil society organizations here in the US that are, surprise, surprise, aligned or funded also by the Qataris and then taken to Congress to show the Congress members how really anti-Semitism is not a problem. It's real. So you have a lot of different, very complex ways in which this is happening. And it's way more complex than a lot of people understand it than just buying someone off. The last thing that I want to say about this, that the investors in anti-Semitism, the foreign ones, so domestically, those are domestic investors, they have direct interest here. The foreign ones don't invent the anti-Semitism here. They invest in what they find. The Qataris did not invent radical leftist anti-Zionism. It was already here. They came and invested in it and made them make a room to their Islamist professors or Muslim Brotherhood professors or whatever. The same thing, the turn in the right and among the pundits in the right that happened recently towards this anti-Israel obsession, the Qataris didn't invent it. They invest in things. So we have to be able also to distinguish between both, between people who actually invest in problems that we already developed on our own.
Let's step back and answer the question, Hussein, of why anti-Semitism is such an efficient tool compared to other forms of propaganda, and that anti-Semitism is what they are then investing in. So why is anti-Semitism such an efficient tool?
Well, that's the demand side question. That's a much more complicated question. That's ultimately the question that I enjoy dealing with because then you have to really, it's theology and philosophy. It's really the question of why anti-Semitism, which is very hard. I think it's very hard to answer. But if I'm going to try to answer it only as relative to the value of political investment, anti-Semitism has an uncanny, and this is something that's been recognized for a very long time, has an uncanny ability to unite people who otherwise would not be united. I mean, look at the lineup that you see today. You have hawks like Tucker Carlson standing next to Muslim Brotherhood Islamists, standing next to Greta Thunberg and environmentalist enthusiasts, standing against radical leftists of every kind. What else? Really, like you would struggle to come up with anything short of an alien invasion, even if that. What else could unite this lineup? So anti-Semitism has this uncanny ability to unite people and create this. It's the perfect negative ideology for a negative age in which there is nothing positive. We can't agree on anything. What I mean by a negative age, negativity is the underlying paradigm or structure for most of what we say today, sadly. And I think people should be aware of this and should stop doing that in their own life. That is, we because we can't really agree on much anymore, and we can't prove much. I mean, part of it has to do with academic developments and philosophical developments of postmodernism and post-structuralism. Everything is arbitrary, nothing is provable, there's no real history, you can't tell any story, so on and so forth. The way that we organize ourselves is against something. So we are, we're anti-fascist, for instance. That's one of the biggest, for example, anti-negative or negative identity structures of the age, being an anti-fascist, being an anti-Nazi, so on and so forth. So anti-Semitism is it's called antisemitism, literally. It's the perfect negative identity structure. I mean, you see the tragedy of the Palestinians. As I said, like their entire identity structure is built on that negative model. So you have its unifying aspect. It's a great negative identity against the Jews. And then, of course, there is the wealth of modern anti-Semitism itself as just a symbolic economy. Just think about the repertoire of images and symbols and ideas and literature that's just out there that can be plagiarized infinitely. And this is something it's actually very uncanny about the phenomenon of anti-Semitism, how you can find an anti-Semitic text. I mean, the classical example of this, the Protocols of Zion, itself a plagiarized text that was written, it's just in a weird process by that Tsarist secret police, against Jews. And then itself being plagiarized in all of these languages, reaching the Middle East, becoming almost a native text in the Middle East. Anti-Semitism itself lends itself to this. So these, I think, properties of anti-Semitism specifically. Now you have concrete, and again, I like to do both. Ideas matter, but also concrete material issues matter. First of all, the state of Israel. The fact is the state of Israel is a reality, and it's the strongest military in the Middle East and the strongest country now in the Middle East. So you have a lot of actual countries who have an interest in trying to undermine Israel because of just this is the power competition. Even if Israel was, a Scientologist, a country of Scientologists, there would have been tension with your neighbors, right? Now, Israel happens to be Jews, so that gives, let's say, Turkey, the opportunity to draw from this very wealth of anti-Semitism and also the popular movement of anti-Semitism in order to try to control the foreign policy of Israel or undermine Israel. So that's an element. And then the second element is that we can't deny the enormous success of American Jews in the United States in the 20th century. I mean, that's part of why America is America. It's giving Jews this opportunity that they haven't had, and who knows how many centuries, to succeed and to become influential. And ultimately, you have people who want to undermine this. But just very quickly, there is an article that I wrote separately, actually, from this, an essay I wrote about the rise of Jewish conservatism, which is a historic event. I don't think people talk about it enough. Jews historically in America are liberal or on the left. In the last 2 decades, you had an increasing, the neocon movement neoconservative movement that started in the 60s, you did have major Jewish presence. Norman Podhoretz, it's probably the icon of this. But in the last 2 decades specifically, you have the gradual rise of a lot of Jewish influence inside the conservative movement itself. Ben Shapiro is one of the most famous conservative pundits in the country, an Orthodox Jew with a kippah. So basically, that puts Jews to a proximity of power and influence. And people who want to have that power and influence can target Jews easily through the tools of anti-Semitism. I believe that's actually one of the key dynamics that are happening within the MAGA movement. Everybody sees that the movement now reached its zenith and success. It achieved power and influence and wealth. What is the future of that movement after Trump? Who's going to be president? Who's going to be influential? So there's a competition to fill those seats already starting now. One of the things that you can use very easily against someone like Ben Shapiro or someone like Dennis Prager or any of the Jews who are influential in the conservative movement is that they are Jews. They should not be here. And I think that's happening. So there are both, what I want to say, there are intellectual and historical and complex, even theological reasons for why anti-Semitism, but there are concrete reasons for why anti-Semitism.
When I hear you talk about anti-Semitism and reading your writings, and you have articulated very clearly the theological underpinnings, the way in which, again, this political economy leverages or utilizes anti-Semitism as a currency, I also want you to walk us through your thinking around how anti-Semitism gets translated into a moral language in the progressive world. How does that happen?
It's a great question. Well, anti-Semitism, since its beginning, was understood itself. So since the beginning of the mid-19th century Germany, and I had to go back that deep in order to understand, like understanding that Arab society was heavily influenced by Europe, that meant that you have to actually understand that the root developments in Europe that then you received, you were down the line. Like me in Egypt, I was basically just down the stream from 19th century Germany. That's what I discovered. It understood itself as a moral movement, always.
Let me just ask though before you go
Yeah.
on, because I really appreciate the intellectual family tree that I'm
Yeah.
imagining in my mind, where Egypt is receiving the thinking and the ideas from a European conception.
Right.
Who's bringing that into the Arab world?
Local intellectuals who are enamored by it. So people like me, basically, so Arabs who just became very westernized and they want to help their society modernize, which is synonym for westernization. And they have to look on what they thought at the time, the most relevant, most powerful ideas that can help them transform these societies from these backward Ottoman fiefdoms, basically, into something that looks like modern nation states that are now rising in Europe. The problem with the triumph of liberalism, it also distorted a lot of the historical views. For a very long time, people thought that the path for progress was totalitarian ideologies. That's really,
Yep.
that's the only way. How are you going to take these millions of uneducated, illiterate peasants who want to do nothing and create a nation out of them? Well, you need a totalitarian state that takes them, puts them in a meat grinder. And from the other side, you get a middle class, modern literate society. There was an infatuation with totalitarian ideologies, whether German romantic nationalism, communism, and there was an attempt to imitate it. And Arab nationalism was basically that translation from these original German terms, specifically into Arabic terms. And then Islamism, even the sequence of the history, I think people get it wrong. People think Islamism is, Islamism actually, there were multiple Islamisms. The Islamism that we deal with today actually came after Arab nationalism.
Correct.
Inherited that legacy of Arab nationalism that Arab nationalism had originally translated from. Now, none of this means, because also, again, I hate identity politics. I think it makes people, I'm sorry to say, it makes people mentally incompetent of seeing the world. All the vocab of coloniality, and also it's not native and it's not indigenous. Please, no, I'm not. Please don't put any of those words in my mouth. I think they make people not smart. I'm going to be honest. Yes, these ideas started in Europe, but then that's it. They blended. There is no going back. They became Arab ideas. It's just, don't tell me native and not indigenous. No, that's the sadness of this, that they have been and became Arab for 100 years, sadly, and they became part of the religion as well. To go back to my point, anti-Semitism from its beginning understood itself, especially in that German, in more moral terms. I mean, ultimately, Jews are the immorality of modernity. They represent the immorality of modernity. If you take that in biological terms, they are the pollutant for the race. But it's a moral term, and it's primarily about a specific form of humanism and a specific understanding of humanism. So it's Judaism against humanity and the Jews against humanity. And I am defending humanity while fighting the Jews. One of the most famous German anti-Semites, actually the man who is said to have coined the term.
Wilhelm Marr.
He has this line that I like to quote because it's just so drastic. If you want humanity to survive, Judaism must end. That's so what I want to say, it's just and he was progressive, by the way, in the 19th century. Obviously, the word progressive also changes what it means from time to place. But the idea that anti-Semitism is some sort of a reactionary, backward-looking idea that only exists with ignorant people, that's only an understanding that happened in liberal United States after the war. Anti-Semitism was a vanguard, truly avant-garde ideology for quite some time. It had huge influence on progressive movements in Europe. Marxist movement, everybody knows the history of Marxist and communist and Soviet anti-Semitism. It's by virtue of this. So the idea, for example, that Zionism, particularly Zionism, is reactionary, right? Zionist nationalism is reactionary, but Palestinian nationalism is progressive. That's a paradigm you see today, but you only encountered it here recently, but that's been the Soviet line since the 1950s, right? Zionism is reactionary, but the Arab nationalism is progressive. And this has to do with the particularities of Marxist theory that we don't have to go through. The word progressive, I think, for a lot of Americans meant something very different. It wasn't tied to a particular theology of history that has to do with the undermine of capitalism, but I think its basic understanding came from the civil rights movement, that being progressive means progress in achieving greater civil rights for marginalized group. I think that's kind of the way American progressive movement understood itself. But that's not what the American progressive movement have been for quite some time, especially from the 1970s. You had two massive influences on the progressive movement in the United States. That's also, let's say, three things that ended up heavily affecting the progressive movement. First of all, the progressive movement itself became academically established, that its home became the academy. That was not the case before the 1960s, but by the 1970s, you already see that's happening. And that was a new development, by the way, like the idea that the clergymen and the theoreticians and the priests of progressive politics are professors. It started happening in the 70s. At the same time this was happening, you had two massive influences on the American university intellectually. You had Third Worldism, which was a huge intellectual movement that really shaped the non-Western world in the mid-century, and very anti-American and a lot of anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic. And then you had a lot of different strains of continental or European philosophy that also ultimately influenced the university. And that opened the door intellectually to a certain kind of leftist and progressive anti-Zionism that really dominated the third world for quite some time. Like everybody remembers in 1977, UN resolution, Zionism is racism, for instance, was a very progressive text. Before that, you can point at progressive anti-Israel text starting from the early 60s, but they were all produced almost exclusively either by the Soviet Union, and those were very propagandistic in nature, or by third world intellectual. One of the earliest ones was Zionism and the Question of Palestine by Fayez Said. He's actually the same man who's going to formulate, he's the principal author of the Zionism is Racism resolution later in 1977. In 1965, he probably issued one of the most important and beginning texts that applies the framework of settler colonialism to Zionism. That was 1965. A few years following him, you had Maxime Rodinson, the French Marxist author, writing about Zionism and settler colonialism. So you had these influences. And here I'm talking about Fayez Said, who's originally actually Palestinian Lebanese and French. And these ideas come from the third world and from Europe and then establish themselves in the American university. Edward Said was a huge, he's kind of the embodiment in all of this. He was both a translation of French thought. I mean, he was the one who really brought Foucault to the American university because, third world elites spoke, everybody the people who know about it, they spoke French fluently. They were very tied to French culture. He was very in line with the advancement of French philosophy. And he himself was obviously from the Middle East, and he started this whole postcolonial identity politic thing. So anyways, these influences ultimately culminated in the development of what became the progressive anti-Zionism, which is heavily influenced by these currents, in my opinion.
Hussein, again, the pieces you're weaving together are rolling off your tongue. For many of our readers, they have not yet read Maxime Rodinson. They maybe know Edward Said's Orientalism, but haven't thought about the influence of French theory and settler colonialists. They haven't. So put this in layman terms for us.
Okay.
And if anti-Semitism is a currency,
right,
that right, left, Islamists can travel in and are utilizing for their own very specific agendas, which we know are not all the same, and yet this horseshoe allows for this alliance, how are they utilizing anti-Semitism with such clear rationality in order to position their particular ideas? And how is it that anti-Semitism has become socially acceptable in the 21st century in America? I'm pushing you.
You had a massive wave of decay and corruption in the American university since the 1970s, to put it in the most simple terms. And the major casualty out of this wave of corruption was the humanities specifically, and it's a very big question of the humanities can ever be back, as a matter of fact. The core discipline in the humanities, on which the humanities were organized, and the humanities themselves is central to the idea of Western civilization, by the way. So the concept of Western civilization is organized around a regime of texts. That's actually what Western civilization is. It's a regime of text and a reading technique for those texts. Once you lose that, that's it. You lift nothing but technology, superior technology, but nothing of the ideas that make the West what it is. This regime of text was institutionalized in the English department. And it was the English department that collapsed. Having a degree in English today means something entirely different than it meant 50 years ago. These developments are directly tied to the problem of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism today. They are not tangential. They are actually central to understanding what do we mean by the attack on Israel is an attack on Western civilization. Right? People were talking about this. This seems to be much bigger than just a disagreement with Israel. There's a threat to the whole West. You're 100% right. But the way that this happened and it built up and the way that it's the different components is working, especially the academic one that has to do with the core cultural meaning of what it is to be a Western civilization, is the story of the advance of really postcoloniality and anti-Semitism in the humanities specifically. That's number one. Statesman and the political man only uses tools that are, or instruments that are effective. Like the tool has to be effective in order for me to deploy it. If it's not effective, why did I deploy it? Like, let's say, like I want to compete over politics in the United States, right? Does it make sense to portray myself as I don't know, I love camels. I own a big ranch of camels. No, maybe if I'm running to a municipal council in Saudi Arabia, yes, that's what even if I hate camels, that's why you want to. You're not going to deploy an ineffective instrument. The instrument has to be tailored. That's what politicians do. Well, what makes a tool effective? It has to be meaningful. It has to mean something to people. The problem is, obviously, that a lot of people, anti-Semitism became meaningful to them for various reasons. Again, how did this happen? I think, of course, there is social aspects to this. Basically, you have crisis. Obviously, you have a social and economic crisis in which people seek an explanation and meaning. But also, you have the people who actually managed to translate, because you have to have translations. You have people who managed to translate the real problems that people are having into this anti-Semitic conception. For example, to go with the American context, obviously, we've had a long wave of economic distortions. That is, we have very high GDP, wealth accumulation that I said have never been better. By the way, we've never been richer and we've never been stronger. Yet there are a lot of people who feel less secure. House ownership, which is very important for the American formation of the middle class, is becoming extremely perilous. Healthcare, everybody knows healthcare has been a major destabilizing issue in the United States for a while. Nobody can touch it. Higher education is the same thing. You've had these issues for a while. These issues led to a series of a wave of economic political instability that we've been going through since the Obama administration. You had Obama, you had Trump, you had all the drama of the first Trump administration, you have the Biden, the whole thing what we've been going through. Now, you have people who managed to take this to young Americans and say, yeah, you've been going through all of this. Let me tell you how it happened. What happened is that you have a foreign country that managed to capture your policy and made it about the Middle East. So we spend all our money and attention on trying to fix their own problems, go to their wars in Iraq and Iran, right? That's the line. And we spent that money, so that money is not spent here to help you. What they managed is to take this very complex and extremely intricate complex of socioeconomic problems that Americans have been going through, and then condense it very nicely and tightly and neatly together in this narrative about Israel. And of course, you have details to this. Oh, well, there is AIPAC, there is Israel Lobby. And then you have professors who help this. John Mearsheimer is probably the most famous one, and his partner in crime, Stephen Walt. They have their famous book, The Israel Lobby, right? And they dog whistle all the time. Even if they don't directly say it in the most egregious anti-Semitic terms, it's very clear to me that they are dog whistling to that all the time. And they translated these problems. So again, I know that you wanted a simple answer, but the problem is the issue is too complex. There's too many parts to it that it's really hard. I don't want people to reduce it because this truly is perilous. I'm not Jewish. Obviously, I care about this because of my own life story, but now I care about this much more because of the future of this country. I have children here. And we need to take this seriously. And if we need to take this seriously, we have to actually deal with all of these various levels at the same time. You have to deal with the academic. We have to deal with the political. We have to deal with the foreign policy aspect of it. We have to deal with the media aspects of it and with the technological aspect of it and so on and so forth.
Looking at these multiple levels, first of all, most people, I would argue, in America are don't knows when it comes to these issues. And I'm not saying that in a negative or pejorative way. They are don't knows. So
they have to make a living. They are not. They don't spend their day on this. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So first of all, they're encountering this anti-Semitic currency, whether the deluge online or in their academic classes, and yet they don't even recognize what they may be seeing, let alone what they may be absorbing.
Right.
So question number one relates to how do we generate greater knowledge, awareness, sensitivity, so that when they encounter it, they can say to themselves, wait a minute, I know what's happening here. That's the first piece. The second piece is, you and I know that so much of the discourse when it comes to this conversation about Israel and particularly the last 2 months with Iran, people will say, this is just political discourse. This isn't anti-Semitic, or I'm just anti-Zionist. I'm not anti-Semitic. So help our listeners understand that element of the conversation as well.
What to do about it? It's, as I said, it's very hard. One of the terrible aspects of what I do, that I can break things down, very analytically, but then I can't give people a program. I think we have to do all what we can everywhere. We have to commit to this, and we have to understand that this is a real fight. This is about our future, and that there are enormous forces on the other side, that we don't have the resources, we don't have their money, we don't have. Our own institutions are failing us badly. I wonder, where are our intelligence, community from all of that? Like, we're basically free game. Our media and information environment is completely open. It's free game for every despot and tyrant in the world to and it's very cheap. $10,000 buys you an AI, Twitter campaign that reaches millions of Americans. And that's nothing, right? So I think we have to everybody who can do something, get involved with their community, whatever you can contribute. You can contribute money, effort, to get as many people educated, deeply educated about this, not bullet points. One of the things, since I'm talking to an audience, maybe a lot of it is Jewish, let me kvitch. Identity politics is awful and it's disgusting. It doesn't matter where I hear it from. Oh, because, this is who I am, I'm traumatized, I'm a Jew. It's not going to help you. You're not meant to win this game. We need to leave that packaged, meaningless language and actually try to talk about the issues seriously. I'm not doing this so we can build another victimized Jewish identity and put it on the pantheon. That's not going to happen. It's not going to help anybody. It's not going to work. That's one. Two, there is no going back. People often, when they have a crisis, they dream about going back to an aerial stage in which this doesn't happen. It's not going to happen. You have to deal with the problem because it exists. So the idea that we're going to go back to America of the civil rights movement, where Jews and blacks are hand in hand together, that's not the same society anymore. First of all, these are not even the only two groups who are on the stage. We have to understand that we can't plagiarize the answers of our problem from the answers that our fathers had to their problems. We have to be inspired by them, but ultimately this is a new question, will require a new answer. Now, the discourse between anti-Zionism, I think a lot of people talk about this, but okay, analytically speaking, in theory, of course, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. In theory, in practice, there is absolutely no distinction between between either. The truth is that most of the attacks and happens in Jews today happens specifically because of under the guise of the hatred of the state of Israel. If it wasn't Israel, it would have been something else. But in theory, there is a distinction. Maybe in the past, maybe 5 years ago, in the university, we could have said, there is a distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Today, in 2026, I think we need to be honest and understand that this distinction is actually have been obviated by the facts and the developments of what happened today. When you see synagogues being attacked, we saw this in New York, we saw this, I think, in Detroit, we saw this in the Midwest, we saw it in the West Coast. It's a synagogue being attacked, and then our mainstream media trying to justify the attack by saying that the poor attacker's family was killed in Lebanon by an Israeli airstrike. And then, of course, they don't mention that were Hezbollah terrorists.
Exactly.
It shows you there is no distinction. We don't need to take that conversation seriously.
We have to wrap this conversation, but I want you to share with us, if you can, your most succinct, distilled insight or warning for Americans as it pertains to this issue.
I came from a society devoured by anti-Semitism. Truly, my own understanding of the modern Middle East, that the obsession with Israel and the obsession with Jews has been the central tragedy that brought so much destruction, so much failure, in various countries. It's truly a corrosive disease that once takes hold, it's extremely difficult to control. And not just it makes people live in a completely fantastic reality in the most destructive sense, but also it becomes itself, it becomes the platform of the worst characters and the worst moral characters in their society that absolutely have no moral scruples. And they start competing with each other. And then they start basically trying to outbid each other in atrocious behavior and atrocious speech. So you go on a spiral in which things go worse and worse. Your institutions collapse, so on and so forth. This definitely happened in many Arab societies. People remember how Lebanon used to be, how Egypt used to be. This can happen here. First of all, the Democratic Party obviously has a huge issue now internally because it's the future of the party. We saw the voting earlier about all the Congress members who voted against, sending bulldozers to Israel, Democrats, because obviously their party is shifting and we have ambition to become presidents. So the future of the Democratic Party isn't going to be Mamdani. Is this kind of third world American figure is going now to be, the central power, is going to replace Jews inside American institutions, left liberal American institutions. So there is a war of replacement it started in the university, right? The third world professor, intellectual who's replacing the Jewish intellectual and as kind of the central figure around which the moral imagination of the left is organized. And now it's happening in the liberal establishment itself on the Democratic Party. And I don't know if this process is going to stop. Now, the other part that I feel there is hope, it's still very difficult, is what's happening within the right. I think the central conservative establishment still has the traditional conservative alliance with Israel, sympathy to the Jewish people. I think that's still there. So the center of power is still with you. The right itself is non-cohesive and very problematic in many other ways, and just it's dissolving into these various directions. So you don't know how hopeful actually the situation is, but you still have to work with everyone. Yes, there is a word of warning. If this continues the way it is, this is bad for everyone, but I don't think it's entirely hopeless. I think there's a lot of people doing the right thing. There is a lot of people who are establishing alternative media. People are taking reforms in higher education seriously, whether through by exploring, actually building the whole new university, which is a great idea. Build a whole new university from scratch to try to counteract the bad influence. Taking foreign influence, I think, is a huge thing. This is very hard to do in a capitalist open country like the United States. There is no law that prevents a university taking a $10 million check from a Middle Eastern country. We need to find a way to deal with this. We did it with China. As a matter of fact, China used to have huge influence operations in the universities before the CIA and the Justice Department cracked on them. But that's because of how much we take China seriously. We need to start taking Middle Eastern countries also seriously.
Hussein, so much of what you've described, deeply resonates. It's one of the reasons I wanted to bring you onto the show and have the conversation. I've had the pleasure of hearing you present. I read your writings. I want your ideas to be part of a larger conversation and have our listeners exposed to your thinking. The reality is, I think for many American Jews in a post-October 7th world, it's the first time they felt shaken and on unsteady ground. For some of us, we saw and felt that 20 years earlier.
Right.
And I think this political homelessness that you're describing is a very real feeling amongst many Jews. And yet the question I have for those Jews and even Americans who may feel politically homeless at this moment is, are they willing to have their eyes wide open in order to do the internal work that you're talking about and recognize the ways in which the Jew hatred is being leveraged and co-opted in a variety of institutions and a variety of ideologies, and in some ways elevated to become almost sacrosanct and sacred. And I hope that folks will take the time not only to listen to this, but actually go to the Abrahamic Metacritic and support your work and read it on Substack and follow your ideas and dive more deeply into the subject. And I think what you have articulated here is just scratching the surface, and we're going to have you back to talk much more and engage more deeply, because your insights and your voice is quite important, and the way in which you've been able to harness deep knowledge about these subjects while also remaining an independent thinker is not, going unnoticed. And so I'm grateful for you.
Thank you, Rachel. And I'm very grateful for your friendship and for having me on the podcast, and for your listeners to listen to us. We're all in this together. Sometimes I say to myself and everyone, this is actually a great time to be alive. I mean, who doesn't want a massive challenge like this to actually help and build a character and actually deal and try to make the world a better place? Sometimes the worst challenge is not having any challenges at all. So we should be grateful that it's been thrown at us an opportunity to actually do something genuinely selfless and genuinely good. And I'm sure that a lot of your listeners are as invested in this as I am.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Hussein. Thank you.
That's a wrap on today's episode of Boundless Insights. Whether you've been with us from the start or are just discovering our show, we're so glad you're here. If today's conversation sparked a question, challenged your thinking, or made you shake your head, I want to hear from you. Email me at podcast@boundlessisrael.org. Your feedback gives us ideas for new topics and new guests. And if you believe these conversations matter, there are 3 ways to support the show. First, hit that follow button so you never miss an episode. Second, help us spread the word. Share an episode with friends and family, post about it, or mention it in a group chat. It really does make a difference. And third, consider supporting our work. Boundless is a nonprofit, and we rely on donors to keep the show going. You can make a gift at boundlessisrael.org/donate. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep the conversation going.